The sun was setting behind the gleaming skyscrapers of Chicago, casting long shadows over the bustling city streets. But in the crowded town square near Jackson Street, one small figure seemed swallowed by the sea of faces. A little girl, no more than 8 years old, sitting alone on a cold bench, clutching a worn-out doll with trembling hands. Her parents had just walked away, disappearing into the crowd, leaving her abandoned as if she were invisible. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're curled up at home or scrolling through your phone, or perhaps you're staring at a photo long forgotten. It doesn't matter what time it is or how busy your world feels right now, but I promise you, today's story will touch your soul in a luxurious penthouse far above the restless streets. A man watched this scene unfold through his floor-to-ceiling windows. Jonathan Pierce, a name whispered in boardrooms from Wall Street to Silicon Valley, a man whose cryptocurrency investments alone could buy entire city blocks, whose portfolio of tech stocks had made him one of Chicago's most feared corporate titans. Yet, as he gazed down at that abandoned child, something stirred inside him that no amount of money, power, or Bitcoin could ever purchase. The leather chair beneath him, worth more than most people's annual salaries, felt suddenly cold against his motionless legs. The October wind rattled the windows of his penthouse, carrying with it the distant sounds of the city. Car horns echoing off Michigan Avenue, the rhythmic clatter of the L train crossing over State Street, the faint aroma of deep-dish pizza from Lou Malnati's drifting up from the streets below. But inside his sanctuary of wealth, Jonathan Pierce existed in a world of profound silence, where even the ticking of his collection of Swiss watches had long since been muffled by the weight of his isolation. Jonathan Pierce was the embodiment of the American dream twisted into something hollow. At 47, his net worth exceeded $800 million, built through a series of brilliant investments in emerging technologies, renewable energy stocks, and yes, even a substantial fortune in cryptocurrency that he'd acquired when Bitcoin was trading for mere pennies. His company, Pierce Digital Solutions, had revolutionized cloud computing for major corporations. Financial magazines had featured him on their covers at least a dozen times, calling him the Midas of the Midwest. His penthouse occupied the entire 50th floor of the prestigious Willis Tower, offering panoramic views of Lake Michigan and the Chicago River. Yet behind the polished veneer of success lay a man drowning in his own achievements. The penthouse was a testament to wealth without warmth. Italian marble floors so pristine they reflected the city lights like mirrors, furniture crafted from rare woods and metals, artwork worth millions hanging on walls that never heard laughter. Every clock in the apartment had stopped at different times, frozen moments scattered throughout rooms that felt more like a museum than a home. Photographs of Jonathan with his late wife Sarah sat sealed behind protective glass, their frames gathering dust like relics of a life that once held meaning. The windows, despite their magnificent view, remained tightly sealed, filtering the vibrant chaos of Chicago into muffled, distant murmurs. Jonathan's physical imprisonment came not from bars or chains, but from the chrome wheelchair that had become his constant companion since the accident 3 years ago. A drunk driver had stolen more than just the use of his legs. It had taken his wife's life, and with it, their dreams of having children, of building a family that would give purpose to all his accumulated wealth. Now he drifted through his days like a specter, haunting his own success, conducting business meetings through video calls, managing his investment portfolio from behind screens, watching his financial empire grow while his soul withered. The irony wasn't lost on him that a man who had built his fortune on connection technologies lived more disconnected than anyone he'd ever known. Room service brought meals he barely tasted, housekeeping maintained spaces he barely occupied, and silence filled the hours between profitable trades and lucrative deals. Meanwhile, just a few blocks away, in a world that pulsed with an entirely different kind of richness, 8-year-old Mia Rodriguez embodied everything Jonathan's penthouse lacked. Her grandmother's small apartment above Abuela's kitchen on Pilsen Street smelled perpetually of fresh tortillas, black beans simmering on the stove, and marigolds from the window boxes that caught the morning sun. The sounds here were alive, children's laughter echoing from Dvorak Park, the gentle scratch of her colored pencils against recycled paper, and her grandmother's voice humming old Mexican lullabies while she cooked. Mia was small for her age, with chestnut hair that caught sunlight like silk threads and eyes so bright they seemed to hold the very sparkle of the Chicago River on a clear afternoon. Her clothes were simple, often hand-me-downs from cousins or finds from the Goodwill on 18th Street, but they were always clean and carried the faint scent of lavender from her grandmother's homemade fabric softener. Her most treasured possession was a rag doll named Esperanza, crafted from scraps of colorful fabric by her grandmother's weathered but gentle hands. Unlike Jonathan's sterile realm of controlled temperatures and filtered air, Mia's world breathed with authentic life. She knew every vendor at the Maxwell Street Market, could identify the different spices by smell alone at the local mercado, and had memorized the schedules of every CTA bus that ran through her neighborhood. Her voice was soft but carried an unusual wisdom that seemed to spring from some deep well of understanding that children shouldn't possess. When Mia looked up at the towering glass structures of downtown Chicago, she didn't see symbols of power or success. She saw souls trapped behind windows, hearts that had forgotten how to sing. That particular October evening, as she sat on the bench near Jackson Street, not abandoned as it appeared, but waiting for her grandmother who was inside the currency exchange, sending money to family in Guadalajara, she found her gaze drawn to one window high above, where a figure sat, silhouetted against the Golden City lights. Jonathan had noticed her before, this small girl who seemed to appear in the square with curious regularity, always clutching that raggedy doll, always sitting with a posture that suggested patience rather than despair. From his elevated perch, he'd watched her interactions with others, how she shared her snacks with stray cats, how she helped elderly strangers with heavy bags, how her presence seemed to brighten the space around her like a small flame in the urban darkness. That evening, something compelled Jonathan to leave his tower for the first time in months. The elevator ride down 50 floors felt like descending into a different world entirely. His personal assistant had arranged for his wheelchair-accessible car, and as he was driven the few blocks to Jackson Street, the sounds of the city grew more immediate, more real. The smell of roasted peanuts from a street vendor, the distant rhythm of salsa music from an open window, the honest cacophony of a city very much alive. When their paths crossed near the bronze statue of a Civil War general, it happened with the sort of quiet inevitability that changes everything. Mia looked up from her book, a Spanish-English dictionary she was using to help her grandmother with tax forms, and their eyes met. In that moment, she saw through the expensive wool coat, past the platinum watch, beyond the obvious symbols of wealth, directly into the hollow space where his contentment should have lived. "You look lonely," she said simply, her voice carrying the slight accent of someone who thinks in two languages. "Why do you hide behind shiny things when your heart feels empty?" The words weren't accusatory or presumptuous, just a statement of fact delivered with the matter-of-fact honesty that only children possess. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with the same curious attention she might give to a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. The question hit Jonathan with the force of a physical blow. In all his years of negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts, of facing hostile corporate takeovers and congressional committees investigating his company's practices, no one had ever spoken to him with such direct simplicity. He found himself speechless, his carefully constructed defenses crumbling before this child's innocent insight. The words echoed in his mind as his driver helped him back into the car, and they followed him all the way back up to his penthouse, where they seemed to reverberate off the marble walls like accusations. At first, Jonathan's mind recoiled from the encounter with all the force his intellect could muster. How dare this child, this small stranger who clearly came from poverty, presume to understand his life or his pain. What could someone who possessed nothing possibly know about the complexities of wealth, the burdens of responsibility, the isolation that comes with success? His skepticism was a shield he'd perfected over years of defending himself against gold diggers, false friends, and business adversaries who saw him only as a pathway to financial gain. From his penthouse office, surrounded by multiple monitors displaying real-time financial data, cryptocurrency prices, and stock market trends, he tried to dismiss the encounter as meaningless. His portfolio was up another 2% that week thanks to a carefully timed investment in renewable energy stocks. His personal wealth had increased by several $1,000,000 just in the time since that brief conversation. Surely these tangible achievements mattered more than the philosophical musings of a child who probably didn't even understand the concept of compound interest. Yet somehow, over the following days, Jonathan found his attention drifting from earnings reports to the windows overlooking the square. He caught himself looking for that small figure with the bright eyes and the patient posture. His rational mind told him this was foolishness, but something deeper, something that had been sleeping for so long he'd forgotten it existed, stirred with curiosity. When he saw Mia again 3 days later, she was feeding breadcrumbs to pigeons near the fountain, her grandmother watching from a nearby bench while talking animatedly on her cell phone in rapid Spanish. Mia noticed his car pulling up to the curb and waved with the casual friendliness of someone greeting a neighbor. There was no calculation in the gesture, no awareness of his wealth or status, just the simple acknowledgement of one human being by another. "My abuela says pigeons are the mailmen of the angels," Mia told him when he approached in his wheelchair. "They carry messages between heaven and earth, but most people are too busy to read them." She scattered more crumbs, and the pigeons cooed appreciatively, their feathers catching the afternoon sunlight. Jonathan wanted to scoff at such childish superstition, but something in the way the light played across her earnest face made the criticism die in his throat. Instead, he heard himself asking, "What kind of messages?" Mia looked thoughtful, as if considering a question of cosmic importance. "Messages about love, mostly. Reminders that beauty is everywhere if you remember how to look. Sometimes they carry prayers from lonely people up to God and bring back hope in their wings." She looked directly at him then. "Are you lonely, Senor Pierce?" The fact that she knew his name should have alarmed him, but somehow it didn't. In a city like Chicago, his face had appeared in newspapers and magazines, often enough that recognition wasn't unusual. What struck him was the way she said it, not with the breathless excitement of someone meeting a celebrity, or the calculating interest of someone seeing dollar signs, but with the gentle concern of someone who genuinely cared. "How do you know who I am?" he asked, though the answer hardly mattered. "My abuela cleans offices downtown sometimes. She says you live in the sky like a prince in a tower, but princes in towers are usually there because they're hiding from something that hurts." Mia's wisdom had the unsettling quality of penetrating directly to truths he'd spent years avoiding. Jonathan felt something crack inside his chest, not break exactly, but shift like ice beginning to thaw. The sensation was terrifying and wonderful at the same time. He found himself returning to the square more frequently over the following weeks, always with some fabricated excuse about needing fresh air or checking on city development projects. But really, he came to see Mia, to listen to her mix of childish observations and startling insights, to feel the gradual warming of something inside him that had been frozen for far too long. As October melted into November, the first subtle changes began to manifest in Jonathan's carefully controlled environment. The housekeeping staff, who had grown accustomed to maintaining pristine surfaces in rooms that never seemed truly lived in, began to notice small differences. The heavy curtains that had remained drawn for months were occasionally pulled back, allowing Illinois sunlight to stream across floors that had seen only artificial illumination. One of the stopped clocks, an antique Swiss piece that had belonged to his grandfather, suddenly resumed its steady ticking, though no one could explain how or why. Jonathan found himself lingering by the windows during his morning coffee, not just observing the city from his elevated remove, but actually seeing it. The way morning fog rose from Lake Michigan like spirits dancing on water. The patterns made by early commuters hurrying along the sidewalks, each person carrying their own invisible burdens and hopes. The way sunlight transformed the glass facades of neighboring buildings into mirrors reflecting the sky. Mia's presence had introduced something into his world that his wealth couldn't purchase and his technology couldn't replicate. An awareness of beauty that existed independent of value or utility. When she told him stories during their afternoon encounters, speaking of her grandmother's garden on the apartment building's roof, or the way music from different cultures blended together during street festivals in Pilsen, Jonathan felt his perspective expanding beyond the narrow focus of profit margins and strategic investments. The child seemed to carry with her a subtle magic that touched everything in her vicinity. Not supernatural, Jonathan's rational mind couldn't accept that, but a kind of natural grace that highlighted beauty and possibility in the most mundane circumstances. When she spoke about her drawings, the way colors could express feelings that words couldn't capture, Jonathan remembered his own forgotten creativity. The architectural sketches he'd drawn as a teenager before business school redirected his talents toward more profitable pursuits. During one of their conversations, as the November air grew crisp and Mia wrapped herself in a colorful knitted shawl that smelled of cinnamon and vanilla, she asked him about his wife. The question came without warning, delivered with the same gentle directness that characterized all her observations. Abuela says you wear sadness like a heavy coat that's too big for you. She thinks maybe you lost someone important, and now you don't know how to take the coat off. Mia's English, while sometimes careful, carried emotional precision that cut straight to the heart of things. Jonathan felt his carefully constructed emotional barriers trembling. For 3 years, he had refused to speak about Sarah with anyone, not his therapists, not his business associates, not even the few family members who still maintained contact. The grief was a private fortress he'd built around the most tender parts of himself, protecting them by keeping them hidden and untouchable. But something about Mia's presence made vulnerability feel safe rather than dangerous. Perhaps it was her age, her obvious lack of agenda, or the way she listened with her whole being, as if his words were the most important thing in the world. Gradually, tentatively, Jonathan began to share fragments of his story. How Sarah had been an elementary school teacher who'd wanted nothing more than to fill their house with children and laughter. How the accident had stolen not just her life, but their shared dreams of family, of purpose beyond profit, of love that would outlast their individual mortality. She sounds like she was beautiful inside, Mia said when Jonathan finished describing Sarah's laugh. The way she'd sung while cooking, her habit of leaving encouraging notes in his briefcase before important meetings. Beautiful inside people don't go away completely. They leave parts of themselves in the hearts of people who love them. The wisdom of this simple statement struck Jonathan like lightning, illuminating a landscape he'd thought lost in darkness. For the first time since the accident, he felt Sarah's presence not as an absence that defined what was missing, but as a continuing love that could still guide and inspire him. That night, in his penthouse that somehow felt less empty than it had in months, Jonathan opened the sealed frames containing photographs of Sarah. The glass had protected them from dust, but it had also separated him from the memories they represented. As he traced her face with trembling fingers, he felt not the familiar crushing grief, but a bittersweet gratitude for having known such love at all. The next morning, he woke to find that 2 more clocks had somehow resumed their gentle ticking. As December approached and Chicago's early winter began painting the city in shades of gray and white, the bond between Jonathan and Mia deepened into something that transcended the obvious differences in their circumstances. She visited him regularly now, sometimes accompanied by her grandmother Anna, a weathered woman in her 60s, whose Spanish accent colored her English with musical warmth, and whose dark eyes held the wisdom of someone who had known real hardship and emerged with her kindness intact. Ana Rodriguez had initially been suspicious of the wealthy man who seemed so interested in her granddaughter. Her experience cleaning office buildings in the Loop had taught her that rich people often viewed others as either useful or invisible, and she couldn't understand what someone like Jonathan Pierce might want with a child from Pilsen. But as she observed their interactions, watched the way her granddaughter's natural compassion seemed to awaken something life-giving in this broken man, her wariness gradually transformed into cautious acceptance. Mia began bringing small offerings to their meetings, a paper flower she'd crafted from recycled materials, a smooth stone she'd found by the lake, a drawing of the Chicago skyline with tiny hearts floating among the buildings like confetti. Each gift was given without ceremony, as if sharing beauty was as natural as breathing. Jonathan, who owned artwork worth millions of dollars, found himself treasuring these humble creations more than any masterpiece in his collection. Their conversations ranged across territories that adults usually avoided in casual interaction. Mia spoke about her fears, worry that her grandmother worked too hard, sadness about not knowing her parents who had returned to Mexico when immigration pressures became too intense, confusion about why some people had so much while others had so little. Jonathan found himself sharing his own anxieties, the meaninglessness of wealth without purpose, the terror of being forgotten after death with no children to remember him, the crushing weight of survivor's guilt that made him question why he'd lived when Sarah hadn't. "My priest, Father Miguel, says that sometimes God uses broken people to do the most important work," Mia told him one afternoon as they watched snow begin to fall over Grant Park. "He says when your heart gets cracked open, it makes more room for love to get in." She was working on a bracelet made from colorful yarn, her small fingers moving with the confidence of someone who created beauty routinely and without self-consciousness. Jonathan watched her hands work, remembering his own childhood when he'd built elaborate structures from Legos and Lincoln logs, when creativity had been play rather than strategy. "What kind of important work?" he asked. "Taking care of each other," she said simply. "Making sure nobody has to be lonely. Remembering that everyone matters, even if they're different from you." She paused in her work to look directly at him. "Especially if they're different from you." These conversations were taking place in an environment that continued its subtle transformation. Jonathan's penthouse, while still luxurious, had begun to feel less like a museum and more like a space where a human being actually lived. Plants appeared on windowsills, gifts from Mia's grandmother's rooftop garden that somehow thrived despite the filtered light and climate-controlled air. The heavy curtains remained open most days now, and natural light played across surfaces that had been shrouded in artificial twilight for years. Music had returned to rooms that had known only silence, not the aggressive trading floor soundtracks or power lunch playlists from his business days, but gentle melodies that Mia hummed during her visits, snippets of Spanish lullabies, church hymns, popular songs she'd learned at school. Jonathan found himself humming along sometimes, his voice rusty from disuse, but growing stronger with practice. The most profound change was harder to quantify. Jonathan's perspective on his wealth was shifting from seeing it as an end in itself to viewing it as a tool for purposes he was just beginning to imagine. During their conversations about inequality and justice, topics that arose naturally from Mia's observations about their different neighborhoods, he found himself thinking about Sarah's dreams of making education accessible to underprivileged children, about the community programs that had shaped his own childhood in working-class Bridgeport before his business success had lifted him into a different social stratosphere entirely. "Money is like water," Mia observed during one of their December meetings, as they shared hot chocolate from a thermos her grandmother had prepared. "If you keep it all in one place, it gets stagnant and smells bad. But if you let it flow around, it makes everything green and alive." The metaphor was so apt, so precisely descriptive of how his accumulated wealth had begun to feel burdensome rather than liberating, that Jonathan laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in longer than he could remember. The sound surprised them both, echoing off the glass walls of his penthouse with a joy that seemed to awaken things that had been sleeping in the corners of the room. That evening, as he sat by the window watching Christmas lights begin to appear in windows throughout the city, Jonathan felt something he had almost forgotten how to recognize: hope. Not the aggressive optimism of a successful business deal or profitable investment, but the quiet, sustainable hope that comes from believing in possibility, in human goodness, in the chance that tomorrow might be better than today. But happiness, Jonathan was about to learn, was fragile, and the world had ways of testing every tender thing that tried to grow in the harsh light of reality. The crisis that would nearly destroy their unlikely friendship was approaching like a storm system moving in from Lake Michigan, visible to those who knew how to read the signs, devastating to everything in its path. The catalyst arrived on a bitter December morning when Anna Rodriguez received a phone call that would change everything. The cleaning company that employed her had lost its contract with one of the major downtown office complexes where she worked, eliminating nearly half her weekly income in a single corporate decision. The news came with the casual brutality of modern economics: budget cuts, efficiency improvements, nothing personal, but the impact on Anna's carefully balanced financial survival was catastrophic. For weeks, Anna had been watching the growing friendship between her granddaughter and the wealthy man with increasing unease. While she couldn't deny that Jonathan seemed genuinely caring and that Mia brightened whenever she spoke about their conversations, Anna's experience had taught her that relationships between the powerful and the powerless were inherently unstable. Rich people, in her experience, were kind to the poor when it was convenient and entertaining, but they disappeared quickly when real problems emerged. The financial pressure of reduced income, combined with the approach of Christmas and the ongoing expense of keeping Mia in a decent school district, pushed Anna past her breaking point. The situation felt uncomfortably reminiscent of other times when wealthy employers had shown interest in her family, usually ending with unreasonable expectations, inappropriate boundaries, or promises that evaporated when circumstances became complicated. On a gray afternoon when Chicago's December wind carried the threat of snow, Anna intercepted Mia on her way to meet Jonathan at their usual spot near the Jackson Street fountain. The confrontation, when it came, was delivered with the fierce protectiveness of a woman who had already lost too much to trust easily. "Mija, we need to talk," Anna said, her voice carrying the authoritative tone that meant serious consequences were approaching. She explained her concerns with the careful precision of someone who had thought through every possible angle. Wealthy men didn't befriend poor children without expectations. Their family couldn't afford to depend on someone else's charity, and the growing attachment between Mia and Jonathan was becoming emotionally dangerous for everyone involved. "But Abuela, he's not like other rich people," Mia protested, her eyes filling with tears that made Jonathan's heart visible in their liquid surface. "He's lonely and hurt, and when I talk to him, he gets less sad." "Isn't that what Jesus would want us to do?" "Jesus also warned about wolves in sheep's clothing," Anna replied, though her voice carried no conviction, only exhaustion and fear. "Rich people have different rules than us, Mija. They can walk away from problems we have to live with forever." The argument that followed was conducted in rapid Spanish, with Mia's voice rising in passionate defense of her friend and Anna's responses growing more firm and final. Jonathan, watching from his car as his driver waited patiently, could understand none of the words but all of the emotion. When Mia finally looked across the square at him, her face streaked with tears, the message was clear. This was goodbye. That afternoon, Jonathan returned to his penthouse to find it had somehow transformed back into the sterile museum it had been before Mia's presence began warming the cold spaces. The plants still growing on his windowsills seemed suddenly fragile, like they might not survive without her regular attention. The clocks continued their gentle ticking, but the sound seemed hollow now, marking time that stretched ahead without purpose or hope. For several days, Jonathan respected Anna's implicit request to stay away, but the separation felt like losing Sarah all over again, watching love disappear beyond his ability to prevent or repair. He found himself driving through Pilsen in the evenings, not stopping or interfering, just hoping to catch a glimpse of the small figure who had brought such unexpected light into his carefully controlled darkness. The crisis deepened when Jonathan's business life intruded with its own set of complications. Pierce Digital Solutions was facing a hostile takeover attempt from a larger tech conglomerate, forcing Jonathan into board meetings, legal consultations, and strategic decisions that required his full attention. The irony was brutal. His wealth and status, which he'd begun to see as tools for good, were now demanding his exclusive focus at exactly the moment when he needed them least. As December wore on toward Christmas, Jonathan felt the familiar patterns of isolation reasserting themselves. Room service meals consumed alone, business calls conducted from his wheelchair, hours spent monitoring financial markets that no longer seemed to matter very much. His portfolio continued its steady growth. His cryptocurrency investments reached new highs, but the numbers on his screens felt as meaningless as statistics from some distant planet. The depression that engulfed him during this separation was different from the grief he'd experienced after Sarah's death. That had been a clean, sharp pain, devastating but comprehensible. This was more insidious, a creeping awareness that he had briefly touched something miraculous and then lost it through circumstances he didn't know how to control or repair. The taste of hope made its absence more bitter than if he'd never experienced it at all. Meanwhile, in the small apartment above Abuela's kitchen, Mia was experiencing her own form of grief. She had lost more than a friend. She had lost her sense of calling, her belief that her heart's natural compassion could make a meaningful difference in the world. Anna found her granddaughter spending long hours staring out the window toward downtown, and her usual cheerfulness had been replaced by a quiet melancholy that broke Anna's heart, even as she convinced herself she'd made the right decision. The miracle that would eventually reunite them and transform both their lives was already taking shape, though neither of them recognized it yet. Sometimes the most powerful interventions arrive in packages so small and humble that they're almost overlooked, like seeds that wait all winter for the precise moment when they can finally break through frozen ground and reach toward light. Christmas Eve arrived in Chicago with the sort of gentle snowfall that transformed the city into something magical, softening harsh edges and muffling the usual urban cacophony into something approaching peace. Jonathan spent the evening alone in his penthouse, watching the snow drift past his windows, and trying to remember what Christmas had felt like when Sarah was alive, when their apartment had smelled of cinnamon and evergreen, when they'd stayed up late wrapping gifts for her students and planning the family they were going to build together. The package arrived on Christmas morning, delivered by a building employee who explained that someone had left it at the front desk, with specific instructions that it be brought up immediately. The envelope was small, made from recycled brown paper, and decorated with crayon drawings of snowflakes and stars. Jonathan's name was written across the front in Mia's careful cursive, each letter formed with the precision of someone who took written communication seriously. Inside the envelope, folded carefully around a pressed wildflower that had somehow retained its color despite the winter season, was a drawing that would change everything. The picture showed two figures, one large, one small, standing together under a sky filled with stars. The larger figure appeared to be standing rather than sitting, and both figures were smiling. At the bottom, in her neat handwriting, Mia had written, "Hope is here. Love always finds a way. Merry Christmas, Mr. Pierce. Your friend, Mia." But it was the small note on the back of the drawing that shattered the careful walls Jonathan had built around his heart. Abuela says sometimes angels come disguised as friends, and sometimes friends come disguised as angels. I think maybe we both got lucky. Jonathan held the drawing with shaking hands, and for the first time in 3 years he wept. Not the bitter tears of grief and rage that had defined his mourning for Sarah, but tears that carried with them a release, a letting go of the guilt and isolation that had imprisoned him more securely than any physical disability. As his tears fell onto the handmade paper, something extraordinary began to happen. The sensation started as warmth spreading through his chest, then moved downward through his torso, reaching parts of his body that had been numb since the accident. It wasn't a sudden, miraculous healing like something from a movie, but a gradual awareness that his legs were responding to signals from his brain, that muscles long dormant were remembering how to function. The doctors had told him that some spinal cord injuries could heal partially over time, but he had long since given up hope for any recovery. Now, with Mia's drawing clutched in his hand and her innocent faith somehow flowing through him like electricity, Jonathan felt his legs trembling with effort as they prepared to support his weight for the first time in years. The process was slow, uncertain, requiring every ounce of determination he possessed, but step by unsteady step, he managed to stand. The physical healing was remarkable, but it was secondary to the spiritual transformation occurring simultaneously. As Jonathan stood in his penthouse apartment, looking out at the snow-covered city with eyes that could finally see beauty, rather than just opportunity, he understood that his recovery was not about him alone. Mia's gift had been more than friendship or even healing. It had been a calling to something larger than his individual pain or happiness. The miracle was not that he could walk again, but that he finally understood why he needed to. The weeks following Jonathan's Christmas morning revelation transformed not just his physical capabilities, but his entire understanding of what wealth could accomplish when directed by love rather than ambition. The first thing he did, once his physical therapy had progressed to the point where he could navigate confidently without assistance, was to research Ana Rodriguez's employment situation with the thoroughness he had once applied to hostile corporate takeovers. What he discovered was a network of systemic problems that extended far beyond one woman's job loss. The cleaning company that had terminated Anna's contract was part of a larger pattern of corporations reducing costs by eliminating services for working families, while the office buildings themselves were owned by investment groups that prioritized profit margins over the human consequences of their decisions. Jonathan's own company had unknowingly contributed to similar situations through its cost-cutting recommendations to corporate clients. But instead of approaching the problem with the aggressive tactics of his business career, Jonathan found himself thinking like someone who had learned to see the world through Mia's eyes, looking for solutions that honored human dignity rather than simply maximizing efficiency. Using his connections and financial resources, he quietly arranged for Anna to be hired by a different cleaning company at significantly better wages, with health insurance benefits and a contract that provided job security rather than at-will employment. The intervention was designed to appear coincidental rather than charitable, preserving Anna's pride while ensuring her financial stability. Jonathan's years of corporate maneuvering proved useful for good, allowing him to solve problems without creating the obligation or embarrassment that overt charity might have caused. Anna never needed to know that her improved employment situation was anything other than fortunate timing and her own excellent work reputation. With the immediate crisis resolved, Jonathan turned his attention to the larger question of how to rebuild his relationship with Mia without violating her grandmother's protective boundaries. The solution came through Father Miguel, the priest Mia had mentioned during their conversations, who agreed to meet with Jonathan at St. Adalbert's Church in Pilsen after hearing about the unusual friendship and the positive changes it seemed to have created in both participants. Father Miguel was a man in his 50s, whose lined face and gentle eyes suggested someone who had spent decades listening to human struggles without judgment. During their conversation in the small church office, surrounded by children's artwork and handmade decorations, he offered Jonathan something he hadn't expected: understanding rather than suspicion. "Mia has talked about you often," Father Miguel said, his English carrying the musical accent of someone who had learned the language as an adult, but mastered its emotional subtleties through years of pastoral care. Her grandmother is protective because she has to be, but she also knows that her granddaughter has a gift for seeing the best in people, for bringing out qualities that others might not even know they possess. Through Father Miguel's mediation, a careful reconciliation was arranged. Anna agreed to meet with Jonathan in the neutral setting of the church, chaperoned by the priest, to discuss the possibility of renewed friendship under clearly defined boundaries. The conversation was initially tense, with Anna's suspicions competing against her growing awareness that her granddaughter had been genuinely sad since the separation, and that Jonathan's interest appeared to be sincere rather than exploitative. "I know you think I want something from Mia," Jonathan said during that crucial meeting, his voice carrying the vulnerability that had become natural since his healing began. "But the truth is, she's already given me more than I could ever repay. She helped me remember what it feels like to be human again, to care about something besides profit margins and stock prices. If I could give her anything in return, it would be the knowledge that kindness matters, that one small person can change the world simply by refusing to let others remain invisible." Anna studied his face for a long moment, her protective instincts warring against her recognition that this broken man had somehow helped her granddaughter bloom in ways that even she hadn't been able to encourage. Finally, she spoke. "Mia has been praying for you every night since I made her stop seeing you. She asks God to help you feel less lonely, to help you remember how to smile. If she's been praying for you, then perhaps I should trust her judgment." The reunion, when it finally happened on a cold January afternoon in Humboldt Park, was marked by the sort of joy that validates every risk love requires us to take. Mia saw Jonathan approaching across the snow-covered playground and ran toward him with the uninhibited enthusiasm of someone whose prayers had been answered in ways she hadn't dared to hope for. When she realized he was walking, slowly, carefully, but definitely walking, her excitement transcended words entirely. "You're standing up," she said, her voice filled with wonder and delight. "Did the doctors fix you? Did prayers help? Did angels help?" Her questions tumbled over each other in a cascade of curiosity and celebration. "I think maybe all three," Jonathan replied, kneeling carefully in the snow to meet her at eye level. "But mostly, I think a little girl helped me remember that some kinds of healing can't happen unless you believe they're possible." Jonathan's transformation extended far beyond his personal recovery to encompass a complete reorientation of his relationship with wealth and power. Pierce Digital Solutions, under his renewed leadership, began developing technologies specifically designed to serve under-resourced communities rather than just maximizing shareholder profits. His investment portfolio shifted to include micro-lending programs, affordable housing initiatives, and educational technology projects that brought high-quality learning resources to schools that couldn't otherwise afford them. But perhaps the most significant change was the establishment of the Sarah Pierce Foundation, named in honor of his late wife and dedicated to supporting the dreams she had carried for expanding educational opportunities for children from immigrant families. The Foundation's flagship program provided full scholarships, mentoring, and family support services for students like Mia, ensuring that financial circumstances wouldn't limit their potential for growth and contribution. Mia became the Foundation's first scholarship recipient, though the honor was presented to her as a recognition of her academic achievement and community leadership rather than charity. Jonathan had learned the importance of preserving dignity while providing opportunity, understanding that the most meaningful gifts are those that build capacity rather than create dependency. The scholarship covered not just tuition and books, but also enrichment programs that encouraged Mia's natural artistic talents and her gift for languages. She began taking advanced classes in creative writing and visual arts, developing skills that would allow her to tell stories and create beauty professionally. Her drawings evolved from simple crayon pictures to sophisticated mixed media works that captured the emotional complexity of urban life, while maintaining her characteristic hopefulness and faith in human goodness. As months passed and their friendship deepened into something resembling a grandfather-granddaughter relationship, Jonathan's penthouse continued its evolution from sterile showcase to lived-in home. The walls that had once displayed expensive artwork now featured Mia's drawings alongside museum pieces, creating an eclectic gallery that represented both refined taste and heartfelt affection. The rooms filled with sounds that money couldn't buy, conversations that mattered, laughter that arose spontaneously, music that expressed joy rather than just providing background ambiance. Anna, too, became part of this extended family, her initial wariness replaced by genuine affection for the man who had helped her granddaughter flourish while respecting the values and traditions that remained central to their identity. She began bringing homemade tamales and pozole to Jonathan's penthouse, teaching him to appreciate flavors and cooking techniques that represented generations of cultural knowledge passed down through immigrant families. The circle of care expanded naturally to include other children from the neighborhood, other families struggling with the same challenges Anna had faced. Jonathan's resources, guided by Mia's compassionate perspective and Anna's practical wisdom, began creating ripple effects throughout the community. Small problems that could destroy family stability were resolved quietly, educational opportunities appeared where none had existed before, and hope began taking root in places where it had been systematically discouraged. Through it all, Jonathan never forgot that his healing had begun with a simple question from a child who saw past his wealth to his loneliness, who offered friendship without expecting anything in return. Every foundation grant, every scholarship awarded, every family helped represented not just charitable giving, but a form of gratitude, an attempt to honor the miracle that had redirected his life from accumulation toward purpose. 5 years after their first encounter in Jackson Street Square, Jonathan Pierce stood before a gathering of foundation scholars, their families, and community leaders in the renovated gymnasium of Benito Juarez Community Academy. His speech that evening was brief, focusing not on his own contributions, but on the young people whose achievements justified every dollar invested in their futures. But as he looked out at the audience, his eyes found Mia, now 13 years old, taller but still carrying that same radiant warmth that had initially captured his attention. She was wearing the traditional Mexican dress Anna had made for the occasion, her hair adorned with flowers, her face glowing with the particular happiness that comes from seeing one's community celebrated and honored. 5 years ago, Jonathan said, his voice carrying easily through the crowded gymnasium, a wise young person asked me why I was hiding behind shiny things when my heart felt empty. I didn't have a good answer then, but I think I do now. Sometimes we hide because we're afraid that if people see who we really are, they might not love us. But what I've learned is that love doesn't come from being perfect or having all the answers. It comes from being willing to let ourselves be changed by the people we care about. After the ceremony, as families shared food and stories in the warm chaos of community celebration, Mia approached Jonathan with a new drawing. This one showing a tree with deep roots and spreading branches full of birds and blossoms and bright fruit. At the base of the tree, 2 figures sat together reading, one large and one small, surrounded by children of all ages who were learning and playing and growing. "This is us," she said simply. "This is how our story looks from the inside." She paused, studying his face with the same penetrating attention she'd shown during their first meeting. "Are you still lonely sometimes?" Jonathan considered the question seriously, as he had learned to consider all of Mia's questions. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But it's different now. Before, I was lonely because I felt separate from everyone else. Now, when I feel lonely, it's because I miss the people I love when they're not with me. That's a much better kind of lonely to have." Mia nodded approvingly, as if he'd passed some important test. "Abuela says that kind of loneliness means your heart is working right. It means you know the difference between being alone and being loved." On a quiet Sunday morning in late spring, as Chicago awakened to the sounds of birds singing in Millennium Park and the distant bells of St. Mary of the Angels calling parishioners to worship, Jonathan sat in his favorite chair by the windows overlooking Lake Michigan. The penthouse had completed its metamorphosis over the years, becoming a space that breathed with life and purpose rather than merely showcasing wealth and isolation. The morning light illuminated walls covered with children's artwork, photographs of foundation events, and handwritten thank you notes from scholarship recipients. The silence was different too, not the oppressive quiet of emptiness, but the peaceful silence of contentment, broken regularly by the sounds of friends calling, home-cooked meals being prepared in his kitchen, and conversations that mattered enough to remember long after they ended. Mia's latest drawing sat framed beside his coffee cup, a panoramic view of Chicago's skyline, with hearts floating among the buildings like confetti, and tiny figures throughout the city connecting to each other through golden threads that represented the bonds of love and friendship and mutual care. It was her most sophisticated work yet, combining artistic skill with the same emotional wisdom that had characterized all their interactions since that first afternoon in Jackson Street Square. His phone buzzed with a text message from Anna, inviting him to Sunday dinner with the extended Rodriguez family, including several cousins who were visiting from Mexico and wanted to meet El Señor Rico que nos ayuda tanto, the rich man who helps us so much. The description made him smile, not because of its recognition of his wealth, but because of its casual inclusion of him in the complex network of family relationships that had become his anchor in the world. As he prepared to leave his penthouse for Anna's apartment, Jonathan caught sight of his reflection in the entryway mirror. The man looking back at him still bore the marks of his earlier suffering. Lines around his eyes, silver threads in his hair, the careful posture of someone whose body had been broken and carefully rebuilt. But there was something else there too, something that hadn't existed during his years of isolation and accumulation, the quiet radiance of someone whose life has found its proper purpose. He thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment, the miraculous series of encounters that had transformed wealth from a burden into a tool, solitude from a prison into a choice, survival into service. The path had required him to release control over outcomes he couldn't predict, to trust in goodness he couldn't guarantee, to invest in people rather than just markets. Most remarkably, he had learned to see his own story as part of something larger than individual success or failure. Every foundation grant that enabled a bright student to attend college, every family crisis resolved through quiet intervention, every community program that grew from seed money into sustainable support represented threads in a tapestry of connection and care that extended far beyond his personal healing. The miracle hadn't been that a wealthy man recovered from his injuries, or even that a lonely person found friendship. The miracle was that love, once awakened, had proven capable of multiplying itself endlessly, creating abundance that no financial fortune could match, and security that no investment portfolio could provide. As Jonathan left his building and walked slowly but steadily toward the L train that would carry him to Pilsen for Sunday dinner with his chosen family, he carried with him the deep satisfaction of someone who had learned the difference between having money and being rich, between success and fulfillment, between surviving and truly living. The city around him pulsed with the same rhythms it had always carried: traffic and construction, music from open windows, the conversations of strangers passing on sidewalks, the eternal dance of human ambition and struggle and hope. But now he was part of that dance, rather than watching it from above, contributing to its beauty, rather than merely consuming its resources. And somewhere in the network of relationships that had grown from one child's willingness to befriend a stranger, in the educational opportunities that would ripple forward through generations, in the quiet kindness that had learned to disguise itself as coincidence and good fortune, the miracle continued to unfold in ways that couldn't be measured or controlled or owned, just exactly as Mia had always known it would. But this story doesn't end with Jonathan's happy walk to Sunday dinner, because real miracles have a way of expanding beyond their original boundaries, touching lives in ways that the first recipients never imagined possible. As Jonathan had discovered, love multiplies exponentially when it's given freely, and the work Mia had begun that October afternoon near Jackson Street was destined to ripple outward in patterns that would surprise even her boundless faith. Over the following years, as Mia grew from a thoughtful child into a remarkable young woman, her natural gifts for seeing the heart of things and drawing out the best in people manifested in ways that transformed not just her own community, but eventually reached far beyond the neighborhoods of Chicago. The Sarah Pierce Foundation became more than a scholarship program. It became a model for how wealth could be deployed to strengthen communities rather than extract value from them. By the time Mia was 16, she had become the foundation's youngest board member, her insights helping to shape programs that addressed not just educational needs, but the complex web of challenges facing immigrant families. Her artistic talents had evolved to include documentary photography and digital storytelling, and she used these skills to create compelling narratives about the families and communities that the foundation served. One of her most powerful projects was a series of portraits titled Hidden Wealth, featuring people like her grandmother Anna, whose contributions to the city's economy and culture were invisible to those who only counted financial assets. The photographs, displayed in a gallery exhibition that drew visitors from across the country, challenged viewers to recognize the difference between being poor and being valuable, between lacking money and lacking worth. Jonathan watched Mia's development with the pride of someone who had witnessed a miracle unfold in slow motion, but more importantly, he saw how her work was inspiring others to recognize their own capacity for transformation. Young people throughout Chicago began reaching out to the foundation not just for scholarships, but for opportunities to contribute their own talents to addressing community challenges. The Foundation's community organizing program, developed in partnership with local churches and cultural centers, trained teenagers to identify problems in their neighborhoods and develop collaborative solutions. These young activists tackled issues ranging from food deserts to immigration advocacy, from environmental justice to violence prevention, always guided by Mia's core philosophy that real change happened through relationship building rather than confrontation. One particularly successful project addressed the digital divide that left many elderly residents of Pilsen and neighboring communities unable to access online services for health care, government benefits, and communication with distant family members. Rather than simply providing computers, the program trained bilingual teenagers to serve as technology mentors, creating intergenerational connections that benefited both the young people who gained confidence and communication skills and the elders who gained access to a wider world. Anna Rodriguez, now in her 70s but still formidable in her advocacy for working families, became the Foundation's Director of Community Connections, a role that formalized her natural gifts for understanding what people needed and how to connect them with resources and opportunities. Her office was a small room in the Foundation's new community center on 18th Street, but her influence extended throughout the network of families and organizations that had learned to trust her judgment and rely on her discretion. The community center itself had grown from a small storefront to a complex that occupied an entire block, featuring classrooms for adult education, a medical clinic staffed by volunteer doctors and nurses, a commercial kitchen where Anna and other grandmothers taught cooking classes that preserved cultural traditions while teaching food service skills that led to employment opportunities, and a media lab where young people created podcasts, videos, and digital art that told the stories of their communities. Father Miguel, now approaching retirement, often observed that the center had become what churches were meant to be, not just places where people gathered once a week, but hubs of mutual support and shared purpose that strengthened the entire neighborhood. The cooperation between the Foundation and St. Adalbert's Church created a model that other faith communities throughout the city began to emulate, leading to a network of holistic community support that addressed spiritual, educational, economic, and social needs simultaneously. Jonathan's role had evolved from benefactor to collaborator, his business expertise contributing to the foundation's strategic planning, while his financial resources ensured that good ideas could be implemented without being constrained by funding limitations. But perhaps more importantly, his own continuing transformation served as evidence that healing and growth were possible at any age, under any circumstances, for anyone willing to remain open to unexpected teachers. His relationship with Mia had deepened into something that transcended categories like mentor and student, grandfather and granddaughter, even friend and friend. They had become co-conspirators in the work of mending a world that seemed determined to divide people by race, class, immigration status, and every other difference that could be weaponized for political or economic advantage. Their weekly conversations, now held in Jonathan's study while they worked together on foundation business, covered topics that ranged from practical concerns about program funding to philosophical questions about the nature of justice and the possibility of building beloved community across lines of difference. Jonathan treasured these discussions not just for Mia's insights, but for the way they challenged him to think beyond the conventional wisdom of his generation and social class. "You know what I think the real miracle is?" Mia said one Thursday evening as they reviewed applications for the Foundation's new program supporting undocumented students who couldn't qualify for traditional financial aid. She was 18 now, a freshman at Northwestern University studying sociology and art therapy, but still carrying the same luminous quality that had first captured Jonathan's attention 7 years earlier. "Tell me," Jonathan replied, setting aside the folder he'd been reviewing and giving her his full attention, as he had learned to do whenever she shifted into the tone that meant she was about to share something important. "I think the miracle is that broken places can become doorways," she said, gesturing toward the long scar on his forearm that remained visible from the accident that had changed his life. "When your heart or your body or your dreams get cracked open, it hurts terribly. But if you don't close up the crack right away, if you let light get in there, sometimes what grows in that broken place is more beautiful than what was there before." Jonathan felt the truth of her words settle into his chest like seeds finding fertile ground. The observation was quintessentially Mia, poetic and practical simultaneously, hopeful without being naive, grounded in her own experience of loss and recovery, but generous enough to offer comfort to anyone who needed it. "I've been thinking about that a lot," she continued, "because next year I want to start a new program at the Foundation. Something for people who are going through the kind of pain you went through after Sarah died, or the kind of fear Abuela felt when she thought she might not be able to take care of me. People who feel like their lives are over, like they don't have anything left to contribute." She pulled out a sketch pad and showed him a drawing she'd been working on, a community garden where people of all ages were tending plots of flowers and vegetables, with pathways connecting different sections and benches where people could rest and talk. In the center was a greenhouse where seedlings were being nurtured, and throughout the garden were small plaques with words of encouragement in multiple languages. "I want to call it the Healing Ground Project," Mia explained, "a place where people can come to work in the earth and grow things, but also a place where they can share their stories and learn that they're not alone. Gardening is good for grief, you know? It teaches you that death feeds new life, that there are seasons for everything, that beauty can grow out of composted sorrow." The idea was so perfectly aligned with everything Jonathan had learned about the relationship between healing and community, between individual transformation and social change, that he felt his eyes filling with tears of recognition and gratitude. This was what Sarah would have wanted their wealth to accomplish, not just providing scholarships or funding programs, but creating spaces where people could discover their own capacity for growth and contribution. "How can I help make this happen?" he asked, and saw Mia's face light up with the joy of someone whose vision had been not just understood, but embraced. The Healing Ground Project became reality 8 months later, Established on a 5-acre plot of land in Douglas Park that had been vacant for decades, scarred by urban decay and neglect, but rich with potential for renewal. The design process brought together landscape architects, community members, mental health professionals, and master gardeners to create a space that would serve multiple purposes while maintaining the peaceful beauty essential for contemplation and recovery. The garden featured raised beds, adapted for people with mobility limitations, sensory gardens designed to provide therapeutic experiences for visitors dealing with trauma, children's plots where young people could learn about nutrition and ecology while developing patience and responsibility, and memorial spaces where families could honor lost loved ones while participating in the creation of ongoing beauty. But the physical garden was only part of the project's genius. The real innovation was in the programming that brought people together around shared work and mutual support. Weekly grief support groups meeting among the rose bushes, cooking classes that taught participants to prepare healthy meals using vegetables they had grown themselves, art therapy sessions where people created sculptures and mosaics from recycled materials, adding beauty to the garden while processing their own experiences of loss and recovery. The project's success attracted attention from urban planners and community development specialists throughout the country. Delegations began arriving in Chicago to study the model and adapt it to their own communities. Academic researchers documented the measurable improvements in mental health outcomes for regular participants, while local media celebrated the visible transformation of a neighborhood that had been written off by municipal authorities for decades. But for Jonathan, the most meaningful measure of the project's impact was the change he observed in individual participants. Men and women who arrived carrying decades of unprocessed grief, who had convinced themselves they had nothing left to offer the world, gradually discovered that their experiences of loss had given them unique capacity to comfort others walking similar paths. Young people who had been written off by schools and social services found that they had real gifts for nurturing growing things and creating beauty from discarded materials. One story in particular embodied everything the project was meant to accomplish. Maria Santos, a 45-year-old woman who had lost her teenage son to gang violence 3 years earlier, began attending the grief support group meetings reluctantly, brought by a social worker who had heard about the program from Ana Rodriguez. Maria had not spoken about her son's death since the funeral, had not worked or left her apartment except for necessary errands, had convinced herself that her life was essentially over. In the garden, working with her hands in the soil, Maria slowly began to find words for her pain. The other group members listened without judgment or advice, simply holding space for her sorrow while sharing their own experiences of loss. As weeks passed and her section of the garden began producing vegetables, Maria started bringing homemade salsa to the group meetings, made from tomatoes and peppers she had grown herself. The salsa was so exceptional that other community members began requesting it for church events and family celebrations. With encouragement from Anna and financial support from the Foundation's micro-business development program, Maria launched a small company producing artisanal salsas and hot sauces, employing other parents who had lost children to violence and donating a portion of profits to violence prevention programs. 3 years after joining the grief support group, Maria stood before a gathering of city officials and community leaders to speak about the Healing Ground Project's impact on her life. Her voice was strong and clear as she described the journey from despair to purpose, from isolation to community leadership, from believing her son's death had ended her story to understanding that his memory could inspire ongoing contributions to the neighborhood they had both loved. This garden taught me that nothing is ever really dead if it becomes food for something new to grow, Maria said, standing near the memorial plaque that honored her son's memory alongside dozens of others who had been lost to violence, addiction, illness, and despair. My boy's life is part of every plant that grows here now. His love is part of every meal we share, every friendship we make, every young person we help find their way. Jonathan watched from the back of the crowd, remembering his own journey from the sterile isolation of his penthouse to the vibrant community connections that now defined his daily life. The path from wealth without purpose to resources directed by love had been illuminated by a child's insight and sustained by countless acts of mutual support and shared commitment to the possibility that broken things could indeed become doorways to beauty. As the ceremony concluded and families spread throughout the garden to tend their plots and harvest produce for evening meals, Jonathan found himself walking the pathways alongside Mia, now 21 years old, and preparing to graduate from Northwestern University with a degree that she had essentially designed herself, combining sociology, environmental studies, art therapy, and community organizing into a program of study that matched her unique gifts and calling. "What's next?" Jonathan asked, a question that had become their traditional way of checking in with each other about dreams and possibilities. "I've been thinking about that," Mia replied, stopping beside the greenhouse where seedlings were being prepared for spring planting. "I want to keep developing the healing garden model, help other communities adapt it to their specific needs and cultures. But I also want to focus more on young people, especially kids who are growing up in situations like I did, families with limited resources but unlimited love, communities that have been marginalized but haven't been broken." She gestured toward a group of teenagers who were preparing raised beds for a new section of the garden, their conversation mixing Spanish and English in the fluid bilingual pattern that characterized their generation. These kids have so much wisdom about survival and community and creativity. They know things about resilience that people in positions of power need to understand, but they rarely get opportunities to share their perspectives in settings where decision-makers are actually listening. Jonathan nodded, recognizing the seeds of another transformative project in Mia's observation. Her gift had always been seeing potential that others overlooked, identifying connections that weren't immediately obvious, imagining possibilities that others dismissed as unrealistic or naive. "What would it look like to create those opportunities?" he asked. "I'm thinking about a program that brings together young people from communities like this with adults who have resources and influence, not just wealthy people like you, but also teachers and social workers and elected officials and business leaders and journalists. Not meetings where adults lecture kids about how to fix their lives, but collaborative workshops where everyone learns from everyone else." Mia's eyes brightened as she developed the idea aloud, a process Jonathan had witnessed countless times over their decade of friendship and collaboration. "We could call it the wisdom exchange. Young people would share their insights about what actually works in their communities, what obstacles they face, what solutions they've developed that never get recognized by official programs. Adults would contribute their knowledge about systems and resources and strategies for creating change at larger scales." The concept was ambitious but grounded, visionary but practical, characteristics that had defined all of Mia's most successful projects. Jonathan could already envision how it might work, the partnerships that would need to be developed, the funding streams that could support it, the evaluation methods that would document its impacts and attract additional investment. But more than the logistical considerations, he was moved by the underlying philosophy that animated Mia's vision. She had never forgotten the lessons learned during her own childhood about the difference between being poor and being powerless, between lacking resources and lacking wisdom, between needing help and being helpless. Every program she designed was grounded in respect for the knowledge and capabilities that people brought to their own challenges, even when they also needed additional support and opportunities. "How can I help?" Jonathan asked, the question that had become his standard response to Mia's innovations. "Well," she said with a grin that reminded him suddenly of the 8-year-old girl who had approached his wheelchair with such confident friendliness. "We're going to need a location for the workshops, funding for materials and transportation, connections to people who might want to participate. But mostly, we're going to need someone who understands that the most important investment is in relationships, not just programs." "I think I know someone who might be able to help with that," Jonathan replied, matching her grin with one of his own. The Wisdom Exchange launched 6 months later with a pilot program that brought together 40 young people from communities throughout Chicago, with an equal number of adults representing various sectors and perspectives. The first workshop series focused on educational equity, a topic that allowed both generations to share experiences and insights while working toward concrete recommendations for policy changes that could improve outcomes for students from under-resourced communities. The format was deliberately informal, with conversations taking place in the Foundation's community center, but also in participants' homes, neighborhood restaurants, local parks, and other settings where young people felt comfortable speaking authentically about their experiences. Adult participants were required to spend time in the communities where their youth partners lived, not as observers or researchers, but as learners seeking to understand contexts they had previously known only through statistics and stereotypes. The recommendations that emerged from the pilot program were remarkably sophisticated, addressing not just funding formulas and curriculum standards, but also the cultural competency of teachers, the accessibility of school buildings and programs for families with limited English proficiency, the disciplinary policies that were pushing students of color out of educational opportunities, and the career counseling approaches that either expanded or constrained young people's sense of what futures were possible for them. More importantly, the relationships developed during the workshop series continued beyond the formal program, creating ongoing partnerships between individuals who might never have encountered each other in their usual routines. Adults who had never questioned their assumptions about troubled youth found themselves mentoring talented young people who challenged their stereotypes while benefiting from their network connections and professional guidance. Young people who had learned to expect nothing from the system discovered that some adults in positions of power were genuinely committed to equity and social justice, willing to use their influence to advocate for policy changes that would benefit communities they didn't personally live in. The pilot program's success attracted attention from foundations and government agencies throughout the region, leading to funding that allowed the Wisdom Exchange to expand its focus beyond education to include criminal justice reform, environmental equity, economic development, immigration policy, and healthcare access. Each new topic area brought together different configurations of participants, but the underlying methodology remained consistent, creating opportunities for authentic dialogue between people whose life experiences had given them different but complementary types of expertise. Jonathan's role in these expanding initiatives had evolved beyond funding and strategic advice to include direct participation as a workshop facilitator and advocate for the policy recommendations that emerged from participants' collaborative work. His wealth and professional connections opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed to grassroots organizations, while his personal story of transformation through unlikely friendship provided a compelling example of how individual change and systemic change could reinforce each other. But the most profound impact of the Wisdom Exchange was on the young people who discovered their own voices and power through the process of being genuinely heard by adults who took their perspectives seriously. Many participants went on to pursue higher education or career paths they hadn't previously considered possible, not because adults had told them what to do, but because they had experienced their own capacity to influence important conversations and contribute meaningfully to complex problem-solving processes. Mia documented these transformations through a multimedia project that combined photography, video interviews, and written profiles to create a collective portrait of young people whose lives had been changed through the experience of being recognized as knowledge holders rather than just service recipients. The project, titled Wisdom Keepers, toured museums and community centers throughout the Midwest, challenging viewers to reconsider their assumptions about young people from marginalized communities while celebrating the remarkable insights and innovations that emerged when those young people were given genuine opportunities to lead. By the time Mia reached her 25th birthday, The various programs she had initiated or inspired were serving thousands of people throughout the Chicago metropolitan area, with affiliated projects operating in cities across the country. The foundation's annual budget had grown to over $20 million, funding everything from individual scholarships to large-scale community development initiatives. But the measure of success that mattered most to both Mia and Jonathan was the strength of the relationships and the depth of the transformations that their work had made possible. The birthday celebration was held in the Healing Ground Project's Community Pavilion, a beautiful structure that had been built by participants using sustainable materials and incorporating design elements that reflected the cultural heritage of the various communities involved in the garden's development. The guest list included scholarship recipients who were now doctors and teachers and social workers, parents whose children had found their way to college through foundation programs, community organizers who had received training and support for their advocacy work, and policymakers who had learned to incorporate community voices into their decision-making processes. But the speakers who moved the audience most deeply were not foundation staff or board members, but participants whose lives had been transformed through the programs that had grown from Mia's vision and Jonathan's resources. They spoke about dignity restored, dreams rekindled, communities strengthened, and hope made real through the daily practice of mutual support and shared commitment to justice. Maria Santos, whose salsa company now employed 15 people and donated regularly to violence prevention programs, spoke about the difference between charity that creates dependency and investment that builds capacity. When I came to the garden, I thought I had nothing left to give, she said, addressing Mia directly. You taught me that my broken heart was actually my greatest strength because it helped me understand other people's pain and know how to offer comfort that really mattered. Anna Rodriguez, now 78 but still serving as the Foundation's Director of Community Connections, spoke about the importance of seeing each person's full humanity rather than just their immediate needs. Mia learned this lesson as a little girl, she said, her voice carrying the pride of someone whose granddaughter had exceeded every dream she had dared to hold. She never saw Mr. Pierce as a rich man who might help us. She saw a lonely person who needed friendship. That's why everything else became possible. Father Miguel, retired now but still actively involved in community organizing through the faith-based coalition that had grown from the partnership between the foundation and local churches, spoke about the spiritual dimensions of the work they had accomplished together. What we have witnessed here is nothing less than resurrection, he said, not the kind that happens once in history, but the kind that happens whenever people choose love over fear, connection over isolation, hope over despair, every day in ways both large and small. Jonathan spoke last, his words carrying the weight of a decade of transformation that had taken him from the sterile isolation of his penthouse to the vibrant community connections that now defined his daily life. He stood in front of the audience without assistance, his physical recovery complete, but secondary to the spiritual healing that had enabled him to find purpose beyond personal success. When I met Mia, I thought I knew what wealth meant, he said, his eyes finding her face in the crowd of people whose lives had been touched by their unlikely partnership. I measured value in dollars and stocks and bitcoins. I believed that success could be accumulated like interest in a bank account. I was rich by every conventional measure, but I was also dying of loneliness and meaninglessness. He paused, gathering his thoughts as he prepared to share the insight that had taken him years to fully understand. What Mia taught me is that real wealth can't be owned. It can only be shared. Every scholarship that enables a student to pursue their dreams, every family crisis that gets resolved through community support, every policy change that creates more equitable opportunities, all of this represents wealth in its truest form. Not money that sits in accounts, but resources that flow through relationships to create abundance for everyone. Jonathan's voice broke slightly as he continued, emotion overwhelming his usual composure. Sarah dreamed of having children who would carry our love forward into the future. I thought that dream had died with her. But what I know now is that every young person whose life has been changed through these programs is part of the family we never thought we would have. Every community that has been strengthened through this work is carrying our love forward in ways more beautiful than we could have imagined. As the celebration continued into the evening, with music and dancing and stories shared in multiple languages, Jonathan found himself walking through the garden alongside Mia, just as they had done countless times over the years. The pathways were illuminated by solar lights that had been installed by high school students learning about renewable energy, and the air was filled with the fragrance of herbs and flowers that had been chosen to bloom at different times throughout the growing season, ensuring that the garden would offer beauty and healing in every month of the year. "Do you ever think about where all this is leading?" Jonathan asked, gesturing toward the pavilion where families from dozens of communities were sharing food and stories and dreams for the future. "Every day," Mia replied, her voice carrying the same thoughtful quality that had characterized their conversations since she was 8 years old. "I think we're building something that's bigger than any of us could create alone. Not just programs or organizations, but a different way of understanding what it means to be human together." She stopped beside the memorial section of the garden, where plaques honored people whose deaths had seemed to end stories, but had actually provided the foundation for new chapters of service and love. "I think about Sarah a lot," she continued, "how her dream of teaching children became the inspiration for everything we've accomplished. How your grief for her became the doorway to healing for thousands of other people. How death and life and hope are all connected in ways we can't plan or control, but we can participate in." Jonathan felt the truth of her words settle into his heart like seeds finding fertile ground. The journey from despair to purpose, from isolation to community, from surviving to serving, had required him to release control over outcomes he couldn't predict and trust in goodness he couldn't guarantee. But the return on that investment had been beyond anything he could have calculated using traditional metrics. "What's next?" he asked, their traditional question that had launched so many innovations over the years. "I've been thinking about that," Mia said, her eyes bright with the particular excitement that meant she was about to share another vision that would challenge everything they thought they knew about what was possible. "I want to find ways to help other people have the kind of experience we've had, not the specific programs or projects, but the underlying transformation that happens when someone discovers their life has purpose beyond their personal happiness." She gestured toward the pavilion, where the celebration was continuing with a spontaneous circle of storytelling. Elders and children taking turns sharing wisdom and wonder. "There are lonely people everywhere, not just wealthy people in penthouses, but also poor people in housing projects, middle-class people in suburbs, young people and old people and everyone in between. People who have convinced themselves that they don't matter, that they have nothing to contribute, that they're too broken or too ordinary or too different to make a difference." Jonathan nodded, recognizing the universal human need for meaning and connection that transcended economic circumstances or social categories. "How do we reach them?" "I think we start by telling stories," Mia replied. "True stories about transformation and connection and the power of unlikely friendships. Stories that help people recognize that miracles happen through ordinary human kindness, not just dramatic interventions or professional services. Stories that remind everyone that healing and hope are always possible, even when circumstances seem hopeless." As they continued their walk through the garden, past raised beds where vegetables were growing in neat rows and memorial spaces where beauty had bloomed from composted sorrow, Jonathan felt the satisfaction of someone whose life had found its proper purpose in service to something larger than individual success. The path from wealth without meaning to resources directed by love had been illuminated by a child's insight and sustained by countless acts of mutual support and shared commitment to the possibility that broken things could indeed become doorways to beauty. The miracle that had begun with a simple question, "Why do you hide behind shiny things when your heart feels empty?" had multiplied exponentially, creating ripple effects that would continue long after both he and Mia had completed their own earthly journeys. In scholarship recipients who would become leaders in their fields, in community programs that would adapt and evolve to meet emerging challenges, in policy changes that would expand opportunities for future generations, in countless individual acts of kindness and connection, inspired by the example of what became possible when people chose love over fear. But perhaps the most important legacy was the simplest, the living proof that no one is too broken to heal, too lonely to connect, too ordinary to make a difference, too different to belong. In a world that often felt divided by every possible category of human difference, they had created evidence that love could indeed bridge any gap, transform any heart, heal any wound, not through magic or miracles, but through the patient, persistent, practical work of treating each person as infinitely valuable and capable of contributing to the common good. As the celebration wound down and families began making their way home through the garden paths, carrying containers of vegetables they had grown and stories they would share with friends and neighbors, Jonathan and Mia made their way back toward the community center, where Anna was overseeing the cleanup with the efficient grace that had made her indispensable to every project she had ever touched. "Abuela," Mia called out in her musical voice, "we need to get Mr. Pierce home before he turns into a pumpkin." Anna looked up from the table she was wiping down and fixed Jonathan with the stern look that always preceded her most important observations. "This old man doesn't need to worry about turning into pumpkins. He already learned the secret of staying human no matter how much money he has." Her expression softened as she continued, "Besides, pumpkins become food that nourishes people. Even that wouldn't be such a terrible thing to become. And have you ever met someone small who changed your life in an immense way? Have you discovered that sometimes the greatest treasures come disguised as the humblest gifts? Tell me your story in the comments. I want to hear about the unexpected angels who have crossed your path, the moments when love taught you lessons that success never could. If this story of Jonathan and Mia touched something deep in your heart, if it reminded you that hope really is here, even when the world feels cold and disconnected, please leave a like and subscribe so this message reaches other souls who need to remember that miracles still happen, that kindness still matters, that one small voice saying, "You're not alone," can change everything. Because in a world that often feels divided by wealth and status and circumstance, we all need to remember this truth. Love is the only currency that grows when you give it away. And sometimes the richest person in the room is the one with the biggest heart, not the biggest bank account. Share this story with someone who needs to believe again. Let it be a reminder that God still speaks through children, that healing comes in forms we don't expect, and that the most important investments we can make are in each other's dreams and dignity and hope. The miracle is always here. We just have to remember how to see it.